Hi, there we go. It's working.
How are you?
Good, good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for being here. Can you see and hear? Okay.
Yes, yeah, can. All good.
Excellent. Excellent. So for folks who are just joining us, I am Lauren with Me Too Many Voices, and I am joined here today with Colleen McDaniel, Violent Femme, as Instagram social media handle, and she is a sexual assault researcher, and she conducts different studies, and we have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about her process and answer some of your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you, Colleen.
Awesome. Okay. So hi everyone. Thanks again for joining, and thanks Lauren for doing this. This is so awesome. I'm so happy to be able to share research. So just a little bit about myself. So I'm a graduate student at Wayne State University. I'm in my 4th year, working towards my PhD, which is crazy to think that I'm already in my 4th year. And I study, as Lauren said, sexual assault, and I look particularly at perpetration in men. So I look at masculinity, peer norms around masculinity, and social perceptions related to all sorts of like pressure and drinking behaviors and adjacent things. So typically I like to start off when I talk about my research with some sort of like caveats to the sexual assault field for those who aren't familiar. So just a few points. Like I said, my research is mostly in men's perpetration, and a lot of that research has focused on men's perpetration against women. And for one, it's because it is the most common type, although a lot of marginalized groups are disproportionately affected by sexual assault. But also because academia is, of course, systemically screwed and racist and transphobic and all of these things. So inherently, in academia, it's more difficult for folks with marginalized identities to get published and to publish about other people with these identities. It's more difficult for marginalized folks to be accepted into the academy and then uplifted if they are able to make it in. And then the research methodology as it exists currently is just very lacking in being inclusive and being able to center those identities and study them in a non-judgmental or non-biased way. So that's sort of you're being warned. This research is very much focusing on cis men and cis women. Okay, so with that to the side, I also have one more note. So the reason that we look at, when we talk about perpetration, we look at men mostly, is not because we hate men, it's not because we're angry feminists, but it's actually because a lot of national and international representative studies have shown that about 98% of sexual assaults are committed by men. So that's the reason that we largely look at men and masculinity, really. So we got a few questions, so I think I'm going to just address those for the most part, but if folks have questions, like, please feel free as we talk. Lauren can watch and interrupt me as we go. Okay, so one question that we get a lot is, how can we measure perpetration? Because it's hard to believe that anyone would ever admit to committing a sexual assault or committing rape. And that's true. So when you actually ask men, have you raped someone or have you sexually assaulted someone, they're not going to say yes. So they'll say no. But when we ask behaviorally specific questions, so for example, have you ever used force or threats or alcohol to get a woman to have sex, so focusing on the behavior rather than the label of that behavior, that's when you get higher rates and people actually saying, yeah, like, I've done this. And it feels really disturbing, and it is really disturbing, but really fascinating, sort of how people, I think, cope with it almost, and sort of come up with like cognitive distortions to justify those actions and make peace with it. That's a whole nother thing though. Okay, so one of the questions that we got also was, what are common motivations of perpetrators? So there is a really great theory about this that I'm going to walk through. And it's called the confluence model. And it's essentially just a model of all these different predictive factors that tell us what are characteristics, beliefs, attitudes, traits, and experiences that lead people or predict if someone will commit sexual assault at some point in their life. So there are some sort of more distal factors that are predictive, but by certainly.
You say distal factors. What is that?
Yeah, thank you. So a distal factor would mean something that is not very, very predictive, and it's definitely not causal. So it's not something like, it's an experience that someone has had, that just because someone has had this experience doesn't mean that they're definitely going to commit sexual assault, but there is still like a relationship, like it's still kind of common. So the best example of this would be witnessing abuse, like of a parent or family member, or experiencing childhood sexual abuse yourself. And so we know, of course, not everyone who experiences abuse themselves is going to turn around and do it to someone else later in life. But that, learned behavior and through other forms of coping, if there isn't ever like healthy coping and with a lot of other factors, then someone with those experiences may be more likely than others to perpetrate. So then from there, we have sort of two, what we refer to them as like constellations. If you think of like stars, they're just like groupings of factors that are very similar. And they're very highly predictive of sexual assault. So they're very closely related to letting us know if someone is probably going to perpetrate at some point in their life. And so those are impersonal sex. So this could be made up of like having a lot of sex partners, having beliefs that casual sex is more preferable to intimate sex, and actually having being younger when you have sex for the first time. And the reasoning, I think, a lot of the theory behind this is that when sex is impersonal and casual, you're not really thinking about the other person's emotions. You're not thinking about their desire, their passion, their pleasure. You're sort of in it for yourself. And in consensual situations, who's to say that there's anything wrong with focusing on your own pleasure? The problem is that when that's taken to that extreme, then you're not even caring if the other person wants to be engaging in the activity at all. And so that's where, that line is crossed, and these sort of more extreme beliefs and more extreme engagement in these behaviors start to become related to people's perpetration patterns. And interestingly enough, actually having more casual partners is also predictive of victimization. But the reason that we think that those are related is because you're just in more situations where there's that risk. And so it's not like a victim blaming thing. It's just there's more exposure and more potential for it. Okay, so then the sort of second, I guess, constellation or grouping of factors that we think about is called hostile masculinity. And so this is a collection of beliefs, attitudes, and experiences that are directly related to masculinity, especially in Western culture. So also keeping in mind that a lot of this is done in the United States, Canada, and like the UK. So masculine norms would be different in certain subcultures, certainly, but definitely in cultures outside of the US in very Western European countries. So some of those would be like rape myth acceptance. So people always ask me, like, how do you know that it's a myth? Or are you just saying that these are myths? Some of the examples would be like, oh gosh. Okay, so very victim blaming things like women over report being raped, or like women make up, lie about being raped, or like if a woman is wearing a short skirt, then it's, you know, she was asking for it, those kind of things. Things that we're all very, unfortunately, very familiar with. And so the measure was actually developed off of experiences of survivors, experiences of people who have been victimized before. And so they are very victim blaming statements, but they're also statements that just don't hold up. So acceptance of rape myths, hostility towards women. So again, something that you don't think that people would admit to, but people really have these underlying, very negative, aggressive feelings about women, that women are lower, that women deserve what they get, that it's sort of their job to put women in their place. I love seeing you nod to this, Lauren, because it's like all too familiar, right? So, and then adversarial sexual beliefs, and relatedly, sexual dominance and sexual entitlement. So these are all constructs that are very much related to beliefs that sex is like about power and control. So I think something that in the sexual violence community we talk about a lot is like sex is about power and dominance, and that's very true. But it is also, it does have this sexual element to it. So sexual assault is really about sex, power, and dominance. And so when you sort of marry those three things together, that's where it starts to get very non-consensual and dangerous. I mean, you start to put you start to see where people are at risk to perpetrate because they have such these just unhealthy views. Yeah. Okay. And then there are also some pathological factors. So these aren't as common, and they're strong predictors for certain groups of men. So I say that because I think there's a narrative, and I actually have more on this in response to a later question that I'm going to address. But there's sort of this narrative, especially I think we all sort of perpetuate it in the anti-violence community because, you know, we want to believe that rape and sexual assault are just committed by like a small group of men who are bad, and if we just like find them all and lock them up and or remove them from society, then like we'll all be safe. But unfortunately that's not the case. And I'll get more into that in a minute, but you know, we want to think that it's these pathological factors, so like narcissism, psychopathy, delinquent behaviors, and those are related just for a certain group of people. So, okay. Another predictor that's really common, and this is the last one that I'll focus on, is heavy alcohol consumption. So perpetrators actually drink more in general than the general population and engage specifically in heavy consumption behaviors. So binge drinking, playing drinking games, and encouraging others around them to drink. And so it's again not one of those things where we're saying that alcohol, like drinking, causes sexual assault, because plenty of people get drunk all the time and don't ever sexually assault anyone. It's really by way of what's called misperception of sexual intent, and then of course these other sort of risk factors like hostility towards women, adversarial sexual beliefs, sort of those types of things. But what misperception of sexual intent is, it's the idea that men tend to overperceive women's friendly interactions as sexual desire. So just having a conversation with someone at a party or a bar and being, you know, that sort of alcohol myopia. And then they have these other problematic beliefs about women, these other negative beliefs. And so they start to read into her friendly behaviors as like, oh, she wants to fuck, she wants to hook up with me, whatever. um and then of course ignoring that or going through, and you know, alcohol has lowers our inhibition. So someone who already is feeling hostile beliefs and feeling dominance and power in what they want in sex, and just feeling like they're entitled to sex, then alcohol is just one way that they can say, okay, I now feel comfortable doing this. It's not this idea that, you know, alcohol makes someone more aggressive or like changes their personality. It's really like, you already have the desire to do it, whether or not you can admit it when you're sober, but when you're drunk and when your inhibitions are lowered, you're capable of it, essentially. Or you're always capable of it, but I guess you're just more likely to actually follow through with it. Okay, so move on to the next question then.
And for folks who are just joining us, because I'm seeing people joining, this is Colleen McDaniel, a sexual assault researcher who is just answering some questions for us. So if you have any, feel free to comment in the chat box, and she's touching on questions that have already been asked. So I'll get the floor back to you.
Awesome. Okay, so this is one that I mentioned a minute ago, but I think is such an important conversation to have, especially as activists and as, you know, folks who are really trying to address sexual violence and stop it. we have this myth about the serial perpetrator, and it's really a myth that's come out of research that was done in the early 2000s, late 90s. A few researchers who published studies and papers that got really famous and picked up by the media. And it's really important research. And I'm not saying that it was like falsified or anything. But to say that this particular body of research really only focuses on one group of perpetrators, and that is the serial rapist. What is his name? David Lisak. He referred to it as the undetected campus rapist. And so it's this person who is, you know, has, I want to say it's like 14 rapes on average by the age of like 24. I mean, it's so young, and it starts in high school and it goes throughout college age. And that group certainly exists. And, you know, those are the folks who have some of these pathological things going on, some of these pathological traits, but they are not by any means representative of the majority of perpetrators. So when we study sexual assault, we actually study, yes, the Frank interview. That it is the Frank interview, which by David Lisak. Yeah. Someone just commented that. So when we talk about sexual aggression, when we study sexual aggression, we actually are measuring it on a spectrum. So we start by asking about sort of, I'm going to say less invasive, because, you know, I don't want to put it on the scale of like what's worse, but less invasive. So like sexual touching. So it could be like grabbing, like at a bar, or groping, things that are still, you know, horrific to experience. But someone may be more willing to admit to it earlier on. And then we sort of do this build up to things that are more invasive and require more force generally. So like the use of alcohol, the use of physical force, which is common, but not as common as some of these other tactics and other types of sexual assault. So like verbal coercion, which is very, very common, right? And very not talked about enough, and definitely not addressed in laws. And I could go on that forever, but I won't. I think we all could. Yeah. But yeah, so anyway, and then it builds up as well, not only in the tactics, but also we start to talk about the acts. So like I said, touching, kissing, fondling, through to penetration of different types and attempted penetration. So vaginal, oral, anal, and so on. I guess that's the touching, but yeah. So um, what we find is that when we measure sexual aggression, so that's this whole spectrum, right? Not just rapists, which would be full vaginal penetration, is the partial to full vaginal penetration is what the current laws determine as rape. But when we measure sexual aggression on this spectrum, including more sexual assaults, we actually see rates that are more like 20 to 30% of men who perpetrate, rather than this 6%, I want to say, is what the David Lesak research shows. So it's a very different narrative to say that 20 to 30% of men will sexually assault at some point in their life versus, oh, it's only this small percent, it's a 6% of psychopaths who are committing sexual assault and committing violent rape against people. And just it just doesn't represent also what most survivors experience. Rape is very common. I'm a rape survivor myself, but most experiences of sexual assault are not penetrative in that way, and are not this like forceful back alley undetected campus rapist. So those studies were really important because they did change the narrative around sexual assault a lot, but definitely not what a lot of the research shows. And I wanted to mention this too, I've actually seen studies that have found up to 60%. So it really, yeah, it's alarming. So in 2015, there was a study that was done, and it really sought to debunk this myth, that the 6% sort of myth. And what this study did was it sort of it put perpetrators on a spectrum across time. So it looked at how many times they perpetrated, what their perpetration looked like, what the risk factors were, and measured it at different time points. And so they did it in a college sample. So it was across 4 years. And of course, that excludes a lot of folks who are not in college. But if we think of it in terms of like a pilot sort of study, something kind of earlier on to tell us what's going on, they found that there were like 4 different sort of paths, is how you can think about it, of how people perpetrate. So there were the 2 paths that I think we think of most commonly. So non-perpetrators, people who just didn't report perpetrating at all across the 4 years. There was the high perpetration rate and serial rape. So people were sort of on this path of, like, if you're thinking of a graph, there's kind of like the low to no, and then this high level of like consistent perpetration. And then there's like 2 diagonals. So rising, so people who came into college were not exhibiting these risk behaviors, were not perpetrating, and then you start to see like either they did it once or they did it a few times and then they never did it again. And then you have this other trajectory or path of people who maybe committed early on in college or maybe committed in high school, but then never did it again. And so when we start to think about it like that, what we actually found, or what this study found, I didn't find it, but what the study found was that perpetration increased and decreased in relation to those risk factors that I talked about earlier. So when people were heavily drinking, when people were around peers who were saying, forced sex is acceptable, and hey man, you got to get laid, like all of these masculine norms, that's when they actually perpetrated. And then they may not have done it again, but it's almost like they're more situational factors that encourage men to perpetrate. And so, not to remove the accountability at all and say that it's not their fault still, but to say that when people are exposed to these unhealthy behaviors, these patriarchal norms, then that's where we start to see this influence where people act in incredibly harmful ways. So I think it speaks to rape culture a lot more. I think really is sort of the takeaway from that. that when, when we're thinking about prevention, we need to talk about masculinity. Like we need to unpack these norms. We need to unpack peer norms and misperceptions about what people think their peers are doing. Because there's actually research showing that people over perceive their friends' acceptance of sexual assault, especially men. Men think that their friends are encouraging of sexual assault behaviors when really their friends, when you ask those friends, they don't feel that way. And so we have to start to, what was that?
That gives me some hope.
Yeah, right? I mean, and it's amazing. And when you think about like, where are they getting those norms from? Like media, what is rape culture? From popular culture, from the rape culture that is all around us in all these different ways, from the very language that we use, right? And so I think it is a lot more hopeful, honestly, too. And I think, so I was going to bring this up in answering the pornography question, but I think it's so relevant here too. I think the most influential quote that I heard that really made me want to go into studying perpetration was from Gail Dines. She's a sociologist who studies pornography, and talks about the harms of like this very patriarchal pornography that we have. And she says rapists are not sexual deviants. They're extreme conformists to rape culture and just to the culture that we have in the United States. So there's like been a long history in the research world of being like, oh, what's wrong with people who rape? What's wrong with sexual assaulters, whatever? And, what makes them so different? But the question shouldn't be what makes them different. The question should be, how do we raise them to be this way? How do we literally day after day, right, encourage young boys and men to be violent? It's the same conversation with like gun violence, like we encourage men to act out in these ways, because that's how we've constructed masculinity. And getting into like the peer norms conversation. So, in I feel like I'm just going off. I'm really fired up now, but okay. In the peer norm literature, like it's widely accepted that masculinity is seen as something that has to be earned. So femininity, like patriarchal femininity, is something that we as women are tied to. So when do you become a woman? Like you become a woman when you get your period, right? Or like when you start to grow breasts, or when you start to have acne. But it's very like all of these bodily changes that tie women to femininity and to womanhood. Whereas for men, man up, like be a man. Like it's always this encouragement of like, you need to earn this. And it can be taken away from you. If you're perceived as gay, if you're perceived as, weak, if you're perceived as too emotional, then suddenly you're not seen as a man anymore. And so what we find in relation to violence is that using violence is seen as an acceptable way in patriarchy and in this rape culture that we have, as acceptable in order to achieve manhood. So if you need to achieve manhood, you want to be seen as masculine, you want to be seen as one of the guys, you need to go out, you need to have sex with women. And if you can't get it because they want to have sex with you, or you can't get it for whatever reason, I don't know why. I don't want to go down like the insult path. I'm so avoiding that. But like, that's when then it's okay for you to use force, and it's okay for you to use alcohol, and it's okay for you to use coercion, because you're entitled to getting sex from women as a man. And women are just trophies for you to show to other men in order to say I'm a man. And it's not explicit like this, right? I mean, men don't talk to each other in that way. But it's implicitly, woven into our culture in, I mean, like every movie, every show, every song about sex, about manhood, whatever. So yeah, so I'm really on my soapbox.
Very informative. I'm learning so much.
I'm so glad.
That we did have a couple of questions that
Oh yeah.
and one was discussing campus rape culture, which you definitely touched on a bit, but if there was wanted to elaborate there. And then also discussing verbal coercion. And I also want to let everyone know, look out on June 20th for Me Too Many Voices and Friends, Survivors of Color. She is going to be talking all about verbal coercion. I'm working on a promo card for that, but I am looking forward to talking to survivors of color and check out.
That would be awesome. So yeah, so campus rape culture is tricky because it shows up in a lot of different ways in the research. So we have it in specific groups where it's very common. So we're all familiar, likely fraternities, athletics, and what I think the the factor that sort of ties those groups together and these high risk groups together, I think is largely around the drinking culture, around like binge drinking on college campuses. So we have, you know, these norms that when you go to a bar, when you go to a party, you go to hook up with someone. And people who are drinking, you know, the sort of misperception that we have is that the norm is that, oh, well, you're here and you're drinking, you must be looking for someone to get with. And then we have these norms around, you know, and you know, within each of these, there are even more norms embedded, like, you know, if I buy you a drink, then you have to be interested in talking to me, or you have to be interested in going home with me. And if you do go home with me, then you must be interested in having sex, because why else would you want to come home with me? People don't just like nice conversation in movies, apparently, you know? Um, so, um, so I think that is sort of a large part, at least in the United States, that I can really speak to, of the rape culture on campuses. I think it's just very centered around alcohol use. There's more research being done on like marijuana and other drugs, but we're just not. At least I haven't read that it's as much of a risk. And date rape is like date rape drugs are certainly happen and are very serious, but alcohol is definitely the most common date rape drug, and I think that's where, you know, bars and parties are sort of breeding grounds for those kind of behaviors for people who are seeking out that kind of perpetration or those opportunities. I hate like the words you have to use to describe these things. Opportunities to assault someone. It's horrible. But yeah, so I don't know if that gets at it enough, or if there is more to that.
I think that's great. That definitely spoke to it. And if they have any follow-up questions, I hope that they will comment in.
Yeah, definitely. And then the other question was about verbal coercion. So, so verbal coercion, especially in the research, is it's hard to get at, I will say, because there are so many different ways that it happens. And when, you know, if you're tuning in, or if you've been been with us the whole time, at the very beginning, I mentioned marginalized groups, and different identities and different subcultures are going to play a major role in how verbal coercion plays out. So what I mean by that is, you know, I think when we typically think of it, it's like, I will break up with you, or I won't date you, or I won't be as committed to you as you want me to be if you don't have sex with me. So that's sort of, I think, what people think of a lot. What a lot of people don't think of is, I will out you if you don't have sex with me. I will tell the community that you're being involved, that you're dating people, or that you're having sex, because in our community, sex and dating are not acceptable. I'll spread rumors about you in other ways. I'll tell you, even if you don't do it with me, I'll tell people that you did it. And so verbal coercion is just tricky, because there's so much that goes into it, and tricky in the sense that it's hard to measure. It's pretty easy when someone tells you someone said this to me, to call it verbal coercion. Because anytime, and I always said this, like in college, I was a peer educator, and we would always say, if the answer is no, and then you have to do something more to change that no to a yes, then it's verbal coercion. Um, and I feel like it can't be more clear than that, but people, will find any excuse to again, like, justify these behaviors. So that is where I think in the research, it's just hard because it's hard to capture it. Then it's also hard, very unfortunately, to like enforce, because in most states there aren't laws saying that verbal coercion can count as sexual assault or as rape, and that, I mean, that's a huge issue because it is so common. And I think, I've kind of been alluding to like this idea of justification. No one wants to see themselves as doing bad behaviors, and I will say that, in even among perpetrators, people have their limit of what they're willing to do. And I think, we've sort of created this strange culture where people know, everyone will say rape is bad. Like, very, maybe there's a group of people out there that will say it's not, like incels or something, but for the most part, everyone's gonna say, yeah, rape is bad. And if you hold someone down and if you give them drugs, like, that is bad. But what we don't acknowledge, is if you continuously ask something, there's someone to do something nonstop for 10 minutes and they get worn out and finally just say yes, that is sexual assault. And we don't say, like, if you mope and you sit there and are just so sad about it and just you just don't like me, I guess, and just like guilt the other person, like, that is sexual assault. And so, like, especially when it comes to, legal action and, any type of punishment or accountability in general, it's hard, and it's not acknowledged a lot of times. So yeah, so verbal coercion is tricky because there's so much that goes into it, and tricky in the sense that it's hard to measure. It's pretty easy when someone tells you someone said this to me, to call it verbal coercion. Because anytime, and I always said this, like in college, I was a peer educator, and we would always say, if the answer is no, and then you have to do something more to change that no to a yes, then it's verbal coercion. Um, and I feel like it can't be more clear than that, but people, will find any excuse to again, like, justify these behaviors. So that is where I think in the research, it's just hard because it's hard to capture it. Then it's also hard, very unfortunately, to like enforce, because in most states there aren't laws saying that verbal coercion can count as sexual assault or as rape. And that, I mean, that's a huge issue because it is so common. And I think, I've kind of been alluding to like this idea of justification. No one wants to see themselves as doing bad behaviors. And I will say that, even among perpetrators, people have their limit of what they're willing to do. And I think, we've sort of created this strange culture where people know, everyone will say rape is bad. Like, very, maybe there's a group of people out there that will say it's not, like incels or something, but for the most part, everyone's going to say, yeah, rape is bad. And if you hold someone down and if you give them drugs, like, that is bad. But what we don't acknowledge, is if you continuously ask something or someone to do something nonstop for 10 minutes and they get worn out and finally just say yes, that is sexual assault. And we don't say, like, you know, if you mope and you sit there and are just so sad about it and just you just don't like me, I guess, and just like guilt the other person, like that is sexual assault. And so, like, especially when it comes to, you know, legal action and any type of punishment or accountability in general, it's hard, and it's not acknowledged a lot of times. So yeah, so verbal coercion is tricky, and I think there needs to be, you know, I don't know where it has to start. I think awareness raising is always always super important. I think we in as researchers need to be better about measuring it and pointing out exactly what it looks like, and showing people that the rates are consistently higher for verbal coercion than any other type of sexual assault. And I think we need people in the legal system out there saying, like, you know, this is a problem and we need to count this. Yeah, so that's verbal coercion. Were there any more questions?
Yes. So I was just looking at, why do many abused males become abusers and women who are abused become healers?
Yeah, so this is tricky. I mean, everything is tough in explaining why it happens. So it's certainly not something that's causal. So to say if someone is abused does not mean that they will abuse. So once we sort of dispel that, we can look at, okay, what are the things that proceed from there? So some of the other related factors, and this isn't my area as much, so I just want to preface this with that. I'm not an expert in this particular area. It tends to be more folks who do like developmental psychology and clinical psychology. But from my understanding of the literature, it's that, so some people who experience abuse or witness abuse may be more likely to get involved with peer groups who engage in trying to think of the word, delinquent behaviors. And that could be for any number of reasons, but there seems to be this connection between abuse and delinquency. And so then it's sort of these peer norms that may start to influence some of those behaviors. Along with that, they may also, if their mental health is not addressed, or if they learn, you know, very unhealthy coping mechanisms, or start to adopt certain traits, like narcissism or psychopathy, then psychopathy, then we can start to see sort of this connection as well. So definitely would never say that folks who are abused will definitely abuse. In fact, many folks recover and become advocates against abuse, and you know, live out very healthy, happy relationships and lives. But when we sort of put these other negative experiences, these other influences, then there starts to create this path that leads to the other factors, like having negative attitudes about women or engaging in more casual sex, and not caring about your partner, and those sorts of factors.
Excellent. Thanks, Frank. But this question is, why do you think the reason rapists don't get a punishment and hard evidence? It really gets to me how messed up the justice system is. Yeah, I feel you on that.
Yeah, I feel like we're all there. So, Man, now this is like my inner women's and gender studies side coming up, because psychology won't tell us anything about that. Well, okay, all right. No, I could go down this road. So from a psychological perspective, the reason is that our justice system is not set up to believe victims, and it's not set up to capture what happens in instances of crime accurately in general. So we have a jury, right? And within juries, there are all sorts of biases, including rape myth acceptance. So believing that it's the victim's fault, believing that it's other factors like things that the survivor does, like how they dress, how much they drank, believing that they're at fault because of those things. So I very much think that a lot of it comes down to the biases of juries. And I mean, okay, so that's that. Go ahead, Lauren.
And a defense attorney will always try to dismiss anyone from the jury that has experienced sexual violence, or someone in their family or known someone that's close to them that has experienced sexual violence. So, which is unfortunate. Those are the people that typically have the education and awareness and insight into what it actually is like.
Yeah, exactly. And they do it on the basis that, like, their argument is that, oh, they're going to be too emotionally charged, they're going to be too connected to the victim. And it's like, no, we're just going to see things clearly and see through your BS. Yeah. So that's sort of one side of it. On the other side, I think from the very moment that a person goes to report their story, they experience nothing but victim blame, pushback, and disbelief. And it starts with the very first officer that they sit down with, who writes down their story and leaves out details and asks them questions that lead them to question themselves in their own memory of what happened. And so it really, it sort of starts from there. And then on top of that, like when we think about trauma in reporting and how people respond to traumatic events, like your memory when you experience a traumatic event is, I mean, it's quite literally your brain is incapable of storing long-term memories because of the effects on the brain that trauma has. So there are a number of like neurotransmitters that are acting on your brain just to keep you stable and respond to what's happening, which is something so unnatural. Like sexual assault is not something that we're hardwired to be able to respond to. And so our body's natural response is this like fight, flight, or freeze. And with all of this going on, or fawn, yes, I always forget, or fawn. And like that response is triggered by like actual, chemicals in our brain, right? And I'm trying to think of her name. She's at Michigan State. I'm going to hate myself for this later. Campbell, Rebecca Campbell. So Rebecca Campbell has an online webinar about the neurobiology of trauma, is what it's called. And it's all about these responses and how our memory is stored and not stored in instances of trauma. And she uses this example, and I love it. I use this when I teach. If you imagine like the world's messiest desk, and then you write down your story, putting every other word on a different Post-it note, and then putting those Post-it notes all over the world's messiest desk, and then walk away from it for like a week, and then come back and then try to put the story back together. That's what recounting trauma is like, because your brain is literally being inhibited from writing those memories down and storing them properly. So, and for a lot of survivors too, the case is that they won't remember specific details until days or even weeks after because of just the pure shock. And so even just in like what's going on within one person and one person's brain, like the reporting system is not trauma informed like that. They don't know that information, and so they're not set up to be able to work with the survivor through remembering and through helping them to, you know, not only have to relive, because I mean, anytime you tell your story, even if it's to a therapist, sometimes like it's still re-traumatizing to have to remember and recount it. And so it's just the reporting system is just not set up to account for that. So I would say that that very initial interaction of just reporting is hard enough. And then of course, you know, you go down like statutes of limitations and all sorts of roadblocks, with like, you know, why now sort of questions. So yeah, I think it's tough. I recently read Chanel Miller's book. Have you read it?
I haven't. I read excerpts from it, but I haven't sat down yet.
It's tough. I mean, it's really tough to get through. So like, yeah, I totally get it. I kind of forced myself. What?
Safety first, always.
Yeah, exactly. I would like always read it like right before I had therapy, and I kind of just forced myself through it, which was probably not healthy. But I will say, and you know, that's one of those cases where there was very hard evidence. I mean, it was very clear, and still, like what Lauren was saying, like there was just so much like outside narrative, so much coming from the defense attorney, and you know, so much denial from the perpetrator. It just like, it's the system just as a whole is just, it's set up against survivors. And even the fact that, I mean, like, not to go on a rant about this, but like as a little side tangent, the way that like the consent laws are set up, I mean, it's, you know, it's this no means no in most states, but then in some states it's even like this idea that yes means yes, so if there is consent, but that doesn't account for like verbal coercion. A lot of times it doesn't account for you know, a lot of different instances, but really what it's getting at with these consent laws is it's saying, well, what was your response? Did you say no? Did you say yes? It's not asking, did you use alcohol to try and get this person to do something? The laws don't ask, like, did you use force? Did you verbally coerce someone? It's not about the experience of the perpetrator, which it should be, because who's on trial, right? From the very laws that we have written in, the victim, the survivor, is on trial. And it's literally set up so that the survivor has to convince a room full of people this happened to me, rather than saying, how should we deal with what he did? And it's just, I mean, it's just a mess. And I have a lot of problems with the legal system. I think that's a whole nother rabbit hole, but yeah, I don't know if that answered that question. That was a rant. Felt good though. Felt good.
Easy to rant about, and you know, just to kind of elaborate a little bit and kind of close up this question. Someone wrote, you know, the first questions the police asked me was, what were you wearing? Were you a virgin? How much did you drink? And, you know, like saying, I feel like those questions weren't needed at all. Exactly. Those are the wrong questions to be asking. And it's unfortunate and such a sign, again, of this ingrained rape culture at all costs.
Amen.
We would delve into the pornography question a little bit and then wrap things up. I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot.
We've covered a lot. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so someone, and I've alluded to this a few times, but someone did ask about pornography and asking if like, how does pornography influence people to perpetrate? So there is a large body of literature in not as recent, but probably like 20, 30 years ago, that looked a lot into pornography. sort of what they found was that it isn't as strong of a predictor as we thought. So it's not quite a causal factor per se. So it's not something that has a strong relationship and we can really say, oh yeah, people who watch violent porn are definitely going to perpetrate, or they're definitely influenced in this way. It certainly can influence people, but I think the question that has been brought up more and more by researchers is who is watching this type of pornography, and is it people who are just, you know, looking, who just come across it and are like, oh, I'm going to watch violent pornography, or is it people who sort of already have these feelings, and then can use pornography as a way to release those desires, or validate themselves with it and say, okay, I can sexually assault because I'm seeing it in pornography, or other people desire this too. Other people, you know, tie in power and dominance and sex all together. So I think it's sort of the theory of around pornography, at least in the psychological community, is, I think, being sort of reimagined in that way. However, I wouldn't say that that's a definitive answer. And I would say from a sociological perspective that a sociologist sitting here would say, probably argue, yes, there is a direct link between violent pornography and perpetration. And that's from this higher unit of measurement. So as psychologists, you know, we look at the individual, whereas sociologists look at more of societal level things. And I would certainly agree that on the societal level, what the porn industry does, and completely excluding consensual, queer, happy erotica, but mass media pornography, gonzo, these really violent types of pornography, I would say contribute to rape culture more broadly. And I think contribute to these norms that we're talking about, and a lot of these misperceptions of peer norms that people have. So this idea that men are over perceiving their peers' acceptance of violent sex, of sexual assault, of rape. So I guess it's sort of a non-answer. Does pornography, you know, influence individuals? I would never say that it doesn't. But I think my guess from what I know of the research is that it's more on the societal level, and it's more on the norms and how it's influencing our culture. And again, just sewing rape culture more and more into every fabric of our existence. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And I also do think it's important, worth noting, and I would be curious about, you know, actual research in my work. It seems very common as well for the survivors, the victims, to watch violence as a way to realize what has happened to them. You watch that and convince this is normal behavior. No level of force and violence is something that is accepted and appropriate, then maybe what happened to me that was violent, you know, is not so bad. So that study to compare to with the perpetrator, you know, against perpetrator studies.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that it's hard enough to talk about sexual violence, and there's so much shame and secrecy with it that being able to admit that, I think, for a lot of folks is, it's just, we're not there. It's still talking about rape taboo.
Yeah.
It's just quite unfortunate, but you know, there's no shame in that as a survivor. I just wanted to say that we need to do to survive. Well, Instagram is actually telling me that we have 1 minute and 3 seconds remaining. I did not say time on live. But thank you again for being here, for educating all of us, for being so, aware and insightful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for doing this series. It's been amazing. I've loved watching it. So